Hi, this is Ray Poynter, and this is Finding and Communicating the Story. Over the next 6 lessons, we're going to run through all of these topics here. So today, it's all about an introduction and an overview. The next lesson, we'll look at qualitative information, then quantitative information. Then we'll move on to the more complex situation where we have multiple data streams, some qual, some quant, maybe some big data. After that, we're going to utilising visualization, and finally, how do we wrap it all up to make sure that we present the story in an impactful way. So why are we so interested in storytelling? Over the last 10 years, there's been a growing realization that it's not enough to pass on data. It's not enough to do good research. It's not enough to even find the message. We need to make sure that we find the right message, that we communicate that in a way that creates impact. And the way that we do that is via stories and via storytelling. So this series is all about how we can do that. And if you want a really good book on storytelling and the different ways that ideas and messages have been able to stick, then I'd certainly recommend this one from Chip and Dan Heath. And I'm going to take an example from their book. Back in 1994, the Centre for Science and Public Interest found out that in a medium-sized bag of the sort of popcorn that you would eat in the movies in the United States had about 37 grams of saturated fat. Now, one of the problems with that piece of data is most of us don't really know what a gram looks like if we had a gram in our hand. The United States Department of Agriculture recommends a maximum in terms of saturated fat of 20 grams. So we have some very clear data, 37 grams, 20 grams. It's not hard when we do the analysis to work out what the message is. You shouldn't be eating movie popcorn. But how do we convey that as a message that's going to create impact? Because a bar chart like this is not going to create impact. Talking about grams, frankly, isn't going to create impact. So what they did was they brought in the press for a press conference, they put out a table and said, right, eating one medium-sized bag of popcorn is the same as having a bacon and eggs breakfast, as having a Big Mac and fries lunch, and a steak dinner in terms of saturated fat. All of that stuff on the right is the equivalent of one medium-sized bag of movie popcorn. Now we have a story with a real punch. During these 6 lectures, you're going to hear me talk quite a bit about what I call robust simplification. What happens when the message you create and you deliver becomes passed from person to person to person? It becomes simplified, and we need to ensure that it still works. Now, if we work with just the data, movie popcorn data, about double your daily fat allowance, it's a relatively simple message, but it's very bland. It no longer has any punch. By contrast, the visual story says one medium-sized pack of movie popcorn is the same as a whole day's worth of unhealthy food. That is a really strong message. That's a message that can be simplified and still have impact. When we look at stories, we need to identify what should be left out. All good stories leave out most of the stuff. This is almost the opposite of classic research, where they tended to try to cram everything, every question that was on the survey, every topic that was on the discussion guide for the focus group, somehow to make it into the presentation. That's not how stories work. Stories depend on leaving out as much as possible. So what was left out of the story here about the popcorn? Are the things in the popcorn? Did it have salt and sugar? Another day, that might actually be the story, but it wasn't the story for this occasion. What about a large bag of popcorn? Well, a medium bag is so bad, we can leave the viewer, the listener, to use their own imagination, that a large bag of popcorn is going to be even worse. Other foods eaten in movie theatres. What about hot dogs? What about ice creams? Yeah, interesting, but they're not needed for this story. We don't need to make every single comparison. Other comparators, normal life, daily life, ordinary meals, yeah, we don't need to cover all the space. We leave things out to make a really strong message. I'm going to also be talking a lot over these 6 lessons about think, feel, do. Now, this is a line of thinking which has come out of the brain scientists, the neuroscience, the behavioral economists and so on, that work out that we integrate these around our life. So if we think about this message, how does it apply to think, feel, do? Think relates to the facts, and I've got them in inverted commas because we know that everything is actually subjective and all facts are processed via an emotional filter. But we have some things here that are broadly agreed. Popcorn has saturated fat. Saturated fat is not good for us, and there are limits to how much you should consume. That's pretty straightforward, and it's relatively neutral stuff. Then we get to the feel. Three junk meals in any one day is dumb, or it's gross, or it's yuck. So what do we want people to do? Well, when you're about to buy popcorn, think about all that fat, feel a bit sick, scared, do trade down or trade away from that popcorn. So we want to be storytellers. We want to be at the center of the room. We want to pick the book. We want to pick the chapter. We want to pick the message and the style of conveying it. And all of that requires a lot of work in the finding and the crafting and the creating. So there's 3 steps, and we're going to spread these steps across the lessons. Finding the story in the data, creating the story, and then communicating the story. So talk about finding the data. Here's the first challenge to you. I want you to look at this screen and see if you can spot the panda. I imagine a few of you spotted it immediately. You just looked at the page and your eye went straight to it. A few others will have looked at the exceptions and you'd have found the red hat and the green hat and the top hat, but not necessarily gone straight to the panda. Well, if you haven't seen the panda yet, let's apply a little bit of a framework. All of the snowmen have got in common a carrot nose and a smiling mouth. So we can read along the rows and see if we can find a face that hasn't got a carrot nose and a smiley face. When we do that, we've found the panda. Now, using that sort of framework will never be as quick as those people who see it straight away. A framework is a reliable, a predictable system, but it tends not to be as instantaneous. So, finding the story in the data, we have these intuitive people. They look at a set of data, they play around with the data, and out pops the message. They just see it. However, these people are usually bad at training other people. And they're often poor at working in teams because the other 2 people in the team may also be intuitive, but their intuition works a different way. They enter the data from a different way. They want to look at it a different way up, and it can make for quite a fraught relationship. A systematic approach is to use frameworks. In my experience, over 35 years now, most of the teams that reliably produce good analysis and useful stories use these frameworks. Individuals are much less dependent on frameworks. If you are a one-man company, you're working from home, and you are really talented at playing with the data, finding the story, crafting a good message, it's not a problem. But if you work in a team, then this is the sort of way you need to go. What are the elements of the frameworks? How to frame the problem, linking the project to the wider context. We need a standard method of organising the data, the qual data and the quant data. We need systematic methods of analysing the data and a preferred method for extracting that story and linking it back to the wider context. Now, there's a great book on this topic by David Smith and Jonathan Fletcher. I'm going to make a mention of it at the end of the presentation. I recommend that you read it. It's very, very useful. But there's one sentence in there which is almost worth half the whole book. A problem defined is a problem half solved. We don't spend enough time defining the problem, and because of that, we don't always know when we found the answer, or the answer is not as good as it might have been. And this is not overclaiming, it's half the problem is defining it properly. Sources of information. There was the original request for the study. We have the proposal. I quite often see research teams doing analysis and they've not reread the proposal that was written that stated what we were going to look for and how we were going to look for it. There needs to be discussions between the sponsors, the insight team and the suppliers. When I talk to client-side folk, what I find increasingly is they're complaining that they're not being asked enough questions. Questions like, what is the background to the project? Why are we doing it now? Not last year or next month, but now. What would success look like? If we gave you the right answer, would you recognize it? What sort of thing would it be? What actions are going to follow the research? Are you going to launch something, abolish something, go into a new market, restructure? We need to know what actions are going to follow from the research if we are going to be able to provide the right sort of answers. And we should collect, what do people think the results are going to be? What does the agency think? What does the client think? What does the end client think they're going to be? What are the prevalent hypotheses? Because we're going to use this information to, first of all, ensure that we test and validate all of these assumptions. We are going to probably disprove some of these assumptions, and we need to know that we're fighting against entrenched views when we do that. We're going to assess the results on a spectrum from good to bad, and this information is really useful for helping create that spectrum. We need to establish what is already known. So the frameworks approach, one of the great things about it is it stops you diving straight into the information. This is one of the things that the intuitives, of course, are not so keen on. The frameworks approach avoids focusing on just the current research project. Too many times when I see a research project debriefed, all of the data that's talked about came from that research project as if it was some sort of island. There are projects before it, there are projects to the side of it. That information should be used too. We need to check on the validity, and we need to blend the research into a wider context. And that context is a web of existing knowledge within your organization, within the agency and the supplier organization, and in the public realm. So here is an incredibly simplified version of a framework. We would get the teams to say, well, who is the project for? And even that's a detailed question, because their first response might be the insight manager, but actually it might not be for the insight manager, it might be for the brand manager, or it might be for the brand manager's boss. What is the business issue problem that's being addressed? Then, what does the business want to do when it's addressed this issue? We need to document down. These are the things that they want to do. So we need to make sure that we have provided some answers that match up to not just the problem, but the actions that need to be taken. What do we already know? Well, we've got this study here, we've got this report here, we've got these learnings here. They're held by different people. Maybe some of it is held by the marketing team. Maybe some of it's held by the digital team. A little bit of description about the key factors. And then we write down these assumptions and predictions about what is going to happen. And we're going to revisit them when we get to the analysis and the storytelling. We've got to assemble the evidence. So the quantitative data, it may need standardizing. It may need the missing data dealing with. We might need to index it. We might need to rebase it. We're going to cover all of this when we do the quantitative section. We'll just highlight one or two things today. In the qualitative, we may have translations to think about, transcripts, notes, memos. All of these need to be brought into the system. We need to look at the nature of the sources, which ones are more credible, which ones have got bias, which ones show interactions with each other. We need to check things like, is the data right? Because we see patterns in the data even when they're not there. So this is a picture dating back to 1976 from Viking 1, a spaceship sent out to explore the solar system. And it went past Mars and it took this picture. And so many people thought that this was evidence of life on Mars, that people had done some sort of sculpture there, that Viking 2, another spaceship, had to be rerouted to take pictures of the same part of Mars but from another angle to show, no, that's just a naturally occurring phenomenon, and our brains have made it look like a face. As we get more and more data, we will get more and more spurious correlations. The worldwide non-commercial space launches is not appropriately correlated, interacting with sociology doctorates awarded in the US. They will relate to either some background phenomenon or simply be chance. And the more data we have, the more spurious correlations we will get. So we need to be cleaning the data, indexing it, referencing it, doing things like this. We're normalizing data here with a growth pattern. What this shows us is in the first 4 years of existence, how many new users did Skype, Twitter, Gmail, Facebook and WhatsApp acquire. And what you can see from that is that WhatsApp is taking a very different trajectory. So that helps explain why Facebook was so keen to buy it. This is one of the standard normalizing techniques. We're going to be looking at normalizing techniques when we get into the quantitative lecture, lesson number 3. We need to look at things with different perspectives. Now this image is over 100 years old, and if you look at it you should see a duck facing to the left, you should see a rabbit facing to the right. You should be able to move very quickly backwards and forwards and possibly even see both at the same time. This is the sort of thing we need to be doing with data. We need to be looking from different perspectives. Every time you see something that you think is a strong message in the data, ask, what are the alternative explanations? Somebody needs to play devil's advocate and say, well, maybe cause and effect goes the other way. Maybe sales are going up because ... Those are the sort of questions we need to ask as part of the finding of the message in the story before we craft and communicate the story. One of the key things about findings, I've been spending a lot of time in the last few months attending visualization events, watching visualization videos, and there's one thing which they always make clear. If you want to understand something, you need a comparator. So here's a great example of what we mean by a comparator. On that finger is an RFID, a radio frequency identifier that can be put into packaging, they can be put into high value banknotes, they can be put into clothes, they can be put into passports and all sorts of devices. So now we know how small they are, because normally we would just say they're very small. Put a comparator, a finger next to it, and we understand better. So what I'm going to do now is show you an example for some health data about the sort of work people have done to clean that data, to structure that data, and to put comparators in place. So we're going to start with some data from Eurostat, and this is about avoidable deaths. Now, there's a complex world of avoidable, preventable, and amenable. And this particular chart focuses on amenable deaths. Deaths that need not have happened if better health advice had been taken, if better health advice had been given, if better health services were available. And there's all sorts of processing that needs to go on behind that. An amenable death has to be under 74 years of age, because if it's after 74, then probably some of these interventions would not have been as impactful. It covers certain categories. The most common amenable death is heart disease, and the key driver of it are smoking and alcohol, but then behind that are other lifestyle things and other intervention things. So somebody pulling this data together, Eurostat, have had to go to all of these separate countries. So we've got the 28 countries of the European Union with the EU midpoint down there slightly to the left. 5 countries closely associated with the EU just to the right. So lots and lots of talking to the people providing the data to clear out the noise, to make sure that it is a proper sample. And then they've broken it into different categories, and the first thing they've done is they've sorted it from the highest rate of amenable deaths per 100,000 head of population through to the lowest. So France has got the best figure and Latvia has got the worst figure. Then they've also made another interesting piece of manipulation of the data. They split it by men and women. And now we can see there are 2 or 3 interesting messages coming out of that data for different audiences. The first one is at a pan-European level, men have more deaths that shouldn't have happened than women. So that is something we need to be aware of. Is it associated with smoking? Is it associated with drinking? Is it associated with turning up for treatment later? How can it be tackled? If we look at the Netherlands, there is almost no difference. So it can be reduced. If we look at Denmark, there is almost no difference. So that would be one story. Another story would be that the Eastern European countries, Poland, Czech Republic, Croatia through to Latvia, have much higher levels. So if we were looking at a European health level, we might say, well, how are we going to tackle those higher levels of amenable deaths? And if we were in those countries, we might very well be saying, look at the shocking disparity between men and women in Estonia, Slovakia, Hungary, through to Latvia. More than twice as likely to die of things that needn't have killed them. So this particular arrangement of the data, once it's had all this cleaning done, is amenable for several types of stories. But let's assume for the moment we're the United Kingdom, which is almost exactly in the middle of the page. And we wanted to tackle health problems in the United Kingdom. This chart is not terribly helpful. It says that that the UK is in the middle. It's behind most of the Western, more developed parts of Europe, so maybe we could use that. But better still would be to process the data or relevant data in a way that made sense. So what we've got here is data for England and Wales that looks at avoidable deaths, which is a slightly different category. It tends to be slightly higher because it's preventable plus amenable. And it looks at the absolute number, because when we're talking about deaths that needn't have happened, we can compare them with zero. We can say 114,740 people died who need not have died. That needs tackling. That needs addressing. And that becomes a very stark message. So we process the data differently, we extract a different piece of it, and now we're supporting a different message within the data. We can see the same thing going on in this data from the CDC in the United States. USA and smoking. It's a leading cause of preventable deaths. How can we bring that alive from the data? And two things here on this report from them. The first is that smoking causes more deaths than all of the following combined: HIV, illegal drug use, alcohol use, motor vehicle injuries, microbial agents and toxic agents. And we also have the comparison with zero: 480,000 deaths, tombstone, caused by cigarette smoking each year. So we're comparing 480,000 deaths with zero. Again, a powerful way of bringing that message forward. So we start off with processing the data. We have some things that we expect to find. We sometimes find things that surprise us. We move forward, we make a message, and then we have to make the impact. How do we embed this framework into an organization? Well, first of all, you have to establish your framework, and it will be an evolving process. Start with something relatively simple, and then build it up from there. Things like listing the knowledge you've already got become easier with time because you can refer to earlier frameworks and take the information forward. Share it with your colleagues. You've obviously all got to be working to the same framework. Share it with your suppliers. You want your suppliers sending you their information and their chunks in ways that fit nicely into your frameworks. Design new projects that produce the inputs that work well with the framework. So you can see that how over a period of 2 or 3 years, this can get smoother and smoother and smoother, and things will arrive in the right format, they will arrive in the right packages, and they will move forward in a good way. So let's move on to finding the story. So we start with knowing what the question is, having an idea of what success looks like. And then we have to find what is the big story. What do most people do? What do most people think? Why do those people do it? Too often I see people diving into the weeds and looking at crosstabs and multiple columns. And we need to come back to that point about a comparator. You have to have something to compare those columns to, and that is the big story. Once you understand the big story, you've got a framework you can put the rest of it to. Then you look at what are the relevant exceptions. And relevant means that they're the right sort of groups, the right sort of splits of the data, and they're big enough exceptions. We really don't want lots and lots of statistically significant but really tiny pieces of information. What we're looking for are substantial truths that make a business difference. Determine how the message in the data answers the business question, and then we craft that. So always coming back to this business question. How do we do that total picture first? Well, if it's quant, it's mostly about looking at the total column as opposed to all those other columns. It's looking for big numbers and big patterns. And let's not look for this one's 36% and that one's only 32%. That will only occasionally be interesting. Usually it's not. We're looking for this one is 60% and that one is 30%. Now we're looking for things that are interesting. That often means reorganizing the data in order to let the big story come out. Once we've found what the big picture is, that will frame the detail and we can move on to find out those nuanced features. With qualitative, it means getting your hands dirty, reading the transcripts, creating notes and memos. Notes and memos are really important if you're working in a team of 4, 5, 6 people across countries and those sorts of things. How does it compare with what is already known? And then what are the main messages? When we come to talk about qualitative in the next lesson, we'll talk about content analysis, we'll talk about things like grounded theory, and creating an architecture so that we find what the overarching structure is for the question we're asking of that particular data set. Always in context of the business question. Now, there is an incredibly tenuous link, usually, between how we find the story and how we should tell the story. We've got lots of multiple data sources. Maybe we're incredibly clever and we've done some fantastic innovative semiotic analysis, or we've done some wonderful hierarchical Bayes, multiple testing, Monte Carlo, stochastic process to find out the meaning of the data. That will not normally be interesting to the client. That is how we found it. It's not what it is. We have differing degrees of confidence in our different data sources, but maybe we do a study, and a conjoint study with consulting surgeons might be our best source of fun. Is that we like the data in there, we look at it, we really understand what it's saying, we come up with a picture for how this drug and this procedure is working with customers and patients. But the best way to tell that story may not work on the best data. Maybe a vox pop video with a customer or patient, which is a really bad way of finding the story, might be the absolute best way of telling the story. So we should break the link in our minds between how we collected the information, how we processed the information, and the story we tell to convey the message we found. Here's a great example from Nora Ephron. Now, Nora Ephron used to be a journalist, but then she became a screenwriter. She wrote When Harry Met Sally and Sleepless in Seattle. And when she was in school, her first day in journalism school, they were taught the 5 W's. This is a story that she's told. She wrote about many times. She told many times. The 5 W's: who, what, when, where, and why. And at the end of the day, they were asked to write the lead for the school newspaper. The entire school faculty will travel to Sacramento next Thursday for a colloquium in new teaching methods. Among the speakers will be anthropologist Margaret Mead, college president Robert Maynard Hutchins, and California Governor Edmund Brown. All the students wrote about the 5 W's. They were asked to write the lead, but they wrote about the 5 W's, the who, what, when, where, and why. Good stuff, but it wasn't right. What was the lead in this story for the school newspaper? No school next Thursday. That's what the readers of the school newspaper would take out as being the absolute essence of that story. All the faculty are going away next Thursday. Yay, no school. When we're looking at our analysis, sometimes what we are reporting, the message, is not in the data, it's of the data. It's implied by the data. Maybe its absence in the data is the story. So we mustn't be too hemmed in with thinking that it's going to be numbers we're talking about. Now, I draw this analogy about the cartographer and the journalist and their different missions. The map maker doesn't know how the map is going to be used. People will have different journeys starting at different starting points with different destinations for different purposes. They will be on bicycles, they will be in cars, they will be walking. So the cartographer has to treat every square on this map as equally important. They have to go into all of the details, they have to cross-tabulate everything, because they don't know what success looks like. They don't know what the business problem is. This is how we come back to the importance of framing the problem. Map makers don't know, so they have to deal with everything. By contrast, the journalists, Bernstein and Woodward, pursued the corruption of Nixon when he was in the White House. They didn't look at everything that happened in the White House. They didn't look at every procedure. They didn't look at China policy and all of these sorts of issues. They followed the money, developed the story, and wow, did they have a big impact. We need to think much more like the journalists than the cartographers. When we come to the key findings, yes, first of all, link them to the project objectives. Yep, we know they are need to know, not nice to know, but you don't throw away the nice to knows. Keep those because you're still going to supply those at some point to the client, to the relevant people, but they're not part of the story. Editing doesn't mean cutting things out and throwing them away. Editing means cutting things out and putting them in the right place. You're looking for things that are supported by patterns or themes in the data, not a single verbatim or a single comment. If you can see a single data point that you think is really relevant, well then you have to hunt through all that other information we talked about, all those other sources, to try to do some triangulation to establish that actually it does represent a theme or a pattern. And clear findings. Now that sometimes means reworking the data groupings to make them clearer. If you find that young people like this particular proposition more, and you find that men like this proposition more, well, have a look to see if young men are an even clearer expression of support for this group. Those are the sorts of regroupings I'm talking about to make those findings stronger and bigger. Then you need to develop your narrative theme, which is going to be your primary axis leading into the elevator pitch. Use a structure that works with the audience. So it's not unusual in the USA to have a structure that starts something like, the main finding was X, so we recommend Y and Z. Now, let's tell you why it's X and why it's Y and Z. But it can be different. It is different in different places. If you are in Japan speaking to a traditional client, then you are quite likely to start the meeting after the greetings with, you asked us to do this, so here is what we did, here are the numbers we found, here are the things that it might have been, and this is the one that we think it is, and our recommendation is this. You have to make sure that you are tailoring your story and your presentation to the audience. But don't think it will always be the same. In 5 years' time, maybe the US audience will have changed. Maybe the Japan audience will have changed. So you need to keep talking to audiences and evaluating what works. One of the key things in evaluating audiences is whether you're giving them good news or bad news. It's much easier to give good news. If they've asked you to test something and it's fantastic, they thought it was going to be great, they're really emotionally behind this 100%, but you've tested it and you go back to them and say, you know what guys and gals, you're absolutely right, this is brilliant. That is a really short meeting, very straightforward meeting. If on the other hand you're going back and it's bad news, this thing you've worked on for 3 years, this thing you absolutely thought was right, it's complete rubbish, that's a really hard meeting. You need to give them lots and lots of warning in advance. You need to talk through it. You need to let them challenge you. You know, you might be wrong. So don't just go into the meeting and fire through. And pretty much all presentations and all stories are either good news, pretty straightforward. Good news, but there are warnings. Hey, people really liked it, but a chunk of them, after they tried it, started to have some doubts. So we think you need to do this, this, and this. Then we have bad news. Okay, they didn't like it mostly, but this group of people did. They could see how we could use it. We think if you were to make these changes, that actually it might be really quite viable. And then we have the really bad news. Yeah, this is not a good idea. It doesn't have any legs. It needs a major rethink. Stop what you're doing to find out how much of a rethink that is. And most stories should fall into one of those 4. Really, it's a balance of good and bad. Just means you haven't thought it through enough. You don't understand what the real business problem is, because nobody is going to recognize a success if you haven't told them whether it's really good or bad or not. it means you don't understand the business problem properly. Now, you might find out you don't know whether it's good or bad, and that's kind of embarrassing. Maybe the research design wasn't good enough. Maybe it's not knowable with the level of finish that they have on their idea or their plan or whatever. You pretty much have to admit that, but you wouldn't do that in a presentation with my recommendation. You would have that conversation way up front with the client to say, okay, we can't even tell you whether this is good news or bad news because there isn't enough in that information. We need to find this out. What are we going to do to address that problem? Somebody I'm going to mention a lot over these 6 lectures, and I've mentioned him a lot in previous webinars and presentations I've given, is Hans Rosling. Swedish, absolute magician with numbers and emotions and ideas and health related stuff. And there's a whole stack of videos of his on the internet you can get to. There's probably 6 or 8 of them just on TED. And I'm just going to take you through 2 or 3 slides. It's not the whole video. This is just 2 or 3 slides from his video. And this was given in Qatar in 2012. So it's in the Middle East. And he's talking about the impact of religion on the number of babies per woman. And he starts off by showing the population data. It used to be much lower. From about 1960, just before 1960, the curve took off. 3 billion people on the planet in 1960. Now we're about 7 billion. Will that just keep accelerating? And he then says, some people say the population will keep growing because some religions stop women from having few babies. Is it true? Now, actually, he knows what the answer to that is. But he knows there's a lot of tension about that question. There are a lot of people in the room who are clearly religious, who are from different religions, but there are a lot of people in the room who are Muslim and who may have some different perspectives. So he's playing with the audience a little bit, setting up the question, but he's not going too fast into the answer. The next thing, he shows how he had to rework the data map, talking about separating the signal from the noise. So he looked at various world maps that had religious groups highlighted, didn't find any of them to be suitable, so they did their own on Gapminder. Gapminder is a brilliant resource. You can all access it. It's up there for free on the internet. It's got about 200 different sets of data streams in there, some fantastic tools. So he created these religions. So the blue circles, bubbles, are Christianity. The size of the bubble is the size of the population. The sort of greenish ones are Islam, and the red ones are the Eastern religions. Now, I was slightly worried the first time I saw this video that he was grouping together Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, Shinto, Taoist, and so on. Lots and lots of religions that are as different as Christianity and Islam. But actually, as you'll see when we go to the data, it works. And then there are 1 or 2 white circles in there, which are countries either where the data is not very good or where no single religion has more than 50% of the country. So he creates a picture of the country here in 1960. And then he starts to plot the data, and he's using 2 scales here. Along the bottom, he's got income, and you'll notice that it's a log scale. So it goes from $1,000 on the left to $10,000 in the middle to $100,000 on the right. And on the left-hand side, babies per woman. So 2 sets of fairly robust data. The babies per woman is census data. It's pretty good. The income, a lot of people spend a lot of money trying to get this income data right. And what he shows in 1960 is that only countries that were Christian and rich had few babies per woman, plus Japan. Japan was the exception. Otherwise, there was a divide between Christian countries that were rich and the rest of the world. Although, if you look at the top, the countries who had lots of babies, 6, 7, 8 babies per woman, there's a lot of blue circles up there. So there were Christian countries and Eastern religions and Muslim countries. Move the clock forward and we see that time is starting to move. Now, obviously, if you watch the video, this is incredible. incredible interactive graphics. But we see most of these bubbles falling towards the bottom. We see China and India, the big red circles, coming down. And now countries don't have to be so rich to have few babies per woman. Move the clock forward again. And now 80% of people in the world live in countries with about 2 babies per woman. All of the Eastern religions are in that bottom category. Doesn't matter how rich they are, all the Eastern religions are in that bottom category. So that is why grouping the Eastern religions together didn't matter, because actually they all end up in this bottom group. What we see now is that pretty much the only people who can't have small families of 2 children per woman are the very poor countries. Less than $1,000 a year income, tend to have very high child mortality rates. Many of them are places like Afghanistan, where there are wars going on, and some really serious problems. But we can also see that the countries with 2 babies per woman are all the religions. We see lots of Christian countries, we see lots of Muslim countries, we see lots of Eastern religion countries. The countries that haven't made it yet are a mixture of countries. There are problems. He identifies the problems relating to education, the role of women in society, but none of them relate to religion. We can just look at the data and take religion out of that equation. So he has made that point incredibly strongly. You can be poor and have few babies. You can have just over $1,000 income, and you can be in that lower group with the right management, with whatever religion your country has. It's not about religion. So please do go and watch the whole video. There's a short link there that you can type in. But when you watch the video, maybe watch it once to understand his message, because his message is very important. But then watch it again and think about how he got to that story. What did he do to the data? How does the story work? And he is very good at using a little bit of humour, a little bit of personal story to keep that information flowing, to keep the audience engaged, particularly when he might be offending them. He makes himself more vulnerable in order to be able to attack some of their vulnerabilities more strongly. He leaves out an enormous amount of information. He's got 200 different data streams. He used just 2 data streams. Would that presentation have been better with 3 sets of data or 4 sets of data? No. The clarity comes from picking the right 2 streams and sticking to it. And he used very, very few numbers in there. It's about directions, and it's about concepts like poverty and war and hunger. It's not about numbers. And we should think about that, because this is based on hundreds of thousands of data points, and he hardly mentions any numbers. A typical market research quantitative presentation is based on thousands of data points, and we mention hundreds of numbers. We need to focus more on the message and less on the numbers when we're telling the story. So, the big picture. Frameworks, that's the way to reach reliable and effective stories. It starts with defining the problem. Then we've got to find the main message. Remove anything that is not the story. And then determine whether it's good news or bad news. Are we confirming or challenging expectations and beliefs? Because that will help us craft the right story and the right way to communicate the story. And that story has got to be engaging, memorable, and simple. And it's not just going to be simple, but it's got to have robustness in the face of simplification. As we make the message simpler, it must keep meaning the same thing. So that's the end of today's part of the proceedings, other than the Q&A, which will come in a moment. Next time, April, we're going to be looking at how we work with qualitative information, how we address the analysis process, the thinking, the creativity, how we discover the story, how we challenge the story, and how we craft the story from that. 2 bits of further reading. Here's the book I mentioned, The Art and the Science of Interpreting Market Research Evidence, David Smith and Jonathan Fletcher, published by Wiley. So if you go to wiley.com, you should be able to find the book there. You can certainly find it on amazon.co.uk. might be more of a problem on Amazon.com these days. A couple of weeks ago, we had the Festival of NewMR. There was a great presentation from Alison Levy and Dower Rademacher from Ipsos, and they were talking about the middle part of the process that I've been talking about today. So how do you get to the great research stories? We've got that data, but how do we get to great research stories? And they've got some fantastic tips, and if you type in the string down the bottom, you'll be able to get to their video, or you can just go to the NewMR website, the Play Again page, go to the Atlantic Monday, and you'll find out what's going on there. So with that, I'll say thank you very much. Please think about following me on Twitter or receiving our weekly mailing, and throw the floor open to Q&A.